Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are going to start in about 12 minutes. So I'm actually going to go off screen and I'll be back in about 12 minutes or so. So for those of you who are watching on video or recording, you'll know I'm about to start when I'm back on screen. But it's always good for me to fire up the YouTube a little bit early before I go live at noon officially. Just to make sure things work out okay. So again, you'll see me in about 11 and a half minutes. And as you notice, I'm in new digs here. I have a new camera and a new background. It's a different vantage point in my office. So see you in a couple of minutes. Okay, I'm going to start. Welcome again to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we're looking at the David and Goliath story in the book of 1 Samuel. It's 1 Samuel chapter 17, a select number of verses from that chapter. So as I do every week when I lead these studies, I structure them around what I call the 3 Ps. So the first is prayer. The second is perspective. And by perspective, I mean some kind of lens or some kind of construct that we might use to help us better understand what it is that we're looking at in a particular reading from the Bible. Because each one of us comes to the Bible with a particular lens, a lens that's been constructed over time for us based on who we are and how we were raised. Issues of class and race and sexual orientation, they all color how we read the Bible. And so each week I try to give us a different lens through which, or different perspective that we can use when reading the Bible, because a different perspective helps us see things that we might otherwise miss. And then the third P is pieces of scripture, and it's almost always a text that's drawn from the lectionary readings for the coming Sunday. So this coming Sunday, we are in ordinary time, and we're going to be looking at the Old Testament reading for this coming Sunday, which is, again, the David and Goliath story. So I'm starting with the first P, prayer. And this is a prayer from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Keep, O God, your household of faith in your steadfast faith and love, that through your grace we may proclaim your truth with boldness and work for your justice with compassion. For the sake of our Savior, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Now, the perspective today comes from this book by Malcolm Gladwell. It's titled David and Goliath, convenient given the scripture readings for this coming Sunday. And what I want to do is read just a few snippets from this to help give us a little historical perspective on the David and Goliath story. So this is what Malcolm Gladwell writes. The Philistines, that's the army that Goliath was a part of, set up camp along the southern ridge of the Elah. The Israelites pitched their tents on the other side along the northern ridge, which left the two armies looking across the ravine at each other. Neither dared to move. To attack meant descending down the hill and then making a suicidal climb up the enemy's ridge on the other side. Finally, the Philistines had enough. They sent their greatest warrior down into the valley to resolve the deadlock one-on-one. He was a giant, 6'9" at least, wearing a bronze helmet and a full body armor. He carried a javelin, a spear, and a sword. An attendant preceded him carrying a large shield. The giant faced the Israelites and shouted out, "Choose you a man and let him come down to me. If he prevail in battle against me and strike me down, we shall be slaves to you. But if I prevail and strike him down, you will be slaves to us and serve us." In the Israelite camp, no one moved. Who could win against such a terrifying opponent? Then a shepherd boy who had come down from Bethlehem to bring food to his brothers stepped forward and volunteered. Saul, the king of Israel, objected. "You cannot go against this Philistine to do battle with him, for you are a lad, and he is a man of war from his youth." But the shepherd was adamant. He had faced more ferocious opponents than this, he argued. When the lion or the bear would come and carry off a sheep from the herd, he told Saul, I would go after him and strike him down and rescue it from his clutches. Saul had no other options. He relented, and the shepherd boy ran down the hill toward the giant standing in the valley. "Come to me, that I may give your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field," the giant cried out when he saw his opponent approach. Thus began one of history's most famous battles. The giant's name was Goliath. The shepherd boy's name was David. Now I'm going to skip ahead and read just a little bit more. Goliath was expecting a warrior like himself to come forward for hand-to-hand combat. It never occurred to him that the battle would be fought on anything other than those terms, and he prepared accordingly. To protect himself against blows to the body, he wore an elaborate tunic made up of hundreds of overlapping bronze fish-like scales. It covered his arms and reached to his knees and probably weighed more than 100 pounds. He had bronze shin guards protecting his legs, with attached bronze plates covering his feet. He wore a heavy metal helmet. He had 3 separate weapons, all optimized for close combat. To the Israelites, this extraordinary array, when hurled by Goliath's strong arm, seemed capable of piercing any bronze shield and bronze armor together. Can you see why no Israelite would come forward to fight Goliath? Then David appears. Saul tries to give him his own sword and armor, so at least he'll have a fighting chance, but David refuses. I cannot walk in these, he says, for I am unused to it. Instead, he reaches down and picks up 5 smooth stones and puts them in his shoulder bag. Then he descends into the valley, carrying his shepherd's staff. Goliath looks at the boy coming toward him and is insulted. Am I a dog, Goliath says, gesturing at the staff, that you should come to me with sticks? What happens next, says Malcolm Gladwell, is a matter of legend. David puts one of his stones into the leather pouch of a sling, and he fires at Goliath's exposed forehead. Goliath falls stunned. The battle is won miraculously by an underdog who, by all expectations, should not have won at all. This is the way we have told one another the story over many centuries. It is how the phrase David and Goliath has come to be embedded in our language as a metaphor for improbable victory. Okay, so after retelling the David and Goliath story, Malcolm Gladwell makes this key point. This is what he says, and it's actually the point of his broader book. Giants are not what they think they are. The same qualities that appear to give them strength are often the sources of great weakness. The powerful and strong are not always what they seem. So Goliath in the story is big and sluggish. Possibly he even has double vision, which would have been a negative byproduct of overactive human growth hormone. So his increased size may have affected his vision, hence the fact that he can't actually see David moving as quickly as David moves. And of course, Goliath relied on big, heavy weapons. He had great strength, but his size and the size of his weaponry made him a big, slow target. David in the story is smaller and quicker. He's more nimble. He's skillful with a sling, and he's able to maximize his strengths while turning Goliath's size into a weakness. So again, Malcolm Gladwell says, giants are not what we think they are. The powerful and strong are not always what they seem to be. The world's giants, the things in our lives that we might think of as giants, can be toppled. And this is going to lead to the end of our time today, where I'm going to ask us to think about who might be the giants in our lives. So this brings us to the story, and I'm going to read snippets from 1 Samuel chapter 17. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 13, verses 17 through 23, and then verses 32 to 50. So it's going to take a few minutes to work through all of this, but it's a classic story, and it's always worth hearing again. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soco, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soco and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. That's verses 1 through 13. Now skipping ahead to verse 17, and we're going to go through 23. Jesse said to his son David, Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard them. Okay, now skipping ahead to verse 32, and this is going to take us through the battle scene. David said to Saul, Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. Saul said to David, You are not able to go out against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. David said, The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, Go, and may the Lord be with you. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. But David said to the Philistine, You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Okay, so back to the beginning story. You have these two armies arrayed, facing each other on hills, and there's contested space in between them. It's some kind of a ravine. And of course, the challenge both armies face is that if you were going to advance against your opponent, you'd have to descend your side, cross the ravine, and be exposed to arrows or spears, and then ascend the other side and have the lower ground, while the opposing army had the upper ground. It would be basically a suicidal tactic. So the two armies are basically at a stalemate, which sets the stage for Goliath to come down and make his offer to the opposing army, the Israelites, saying, "Send a man forward that he may fight with me. The death, and the winner will mean that that person's army is a day." In verses 4 to 7, early on in the story, Goliath is called a champion. Literally in Hebrew, he's called the man in between. What is he in between? I mean, literally, spatially, he's in between these two armies. But perhaps there's this kind of heroic side to this man in between phrase. Maybe he's in between men and gods. We might think of him that way because his size is so enormous and so imposing. The way he's described in verses 4 and following, he's described in these grandiose terms. He's a man of hulking size with gargantuan size weapons. So the text actually says he's 6 cubits and a span, which would make him somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 10 feet tall. There's actually a different version of this story that was discovered in the 4th cave in Qumran, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in that version of the story, Goliath is said to be 4 cubits and a span, which would make him 6 feet 9 inches, or roughly that size, which incidentally is also the size that Malcolm Gladwell says that Goliath was. So not just his height, but also the weaponry that he carries and also his armor, they're enormous in size. And it's interesting the way they're described by the narrator. The narrator of the story almost describes Goliath's armor in Homeric terms. So if you go back and read the Iliad, for example, Homer goes to great length in some places to describe the armor and the weapons of the warriors in the story. And this narrator seems to be doing something similar with respect to Goliath. So talking about his helmet and his shield, the spear he carried, etc., etc. The story says that Goliath's coat of mail weighed 5,000 bronze shekels, which would place it somewhere in the vicinity of about 125 pounds. So it's this massive coat of mail that he's wearing. He's this hulking figure. And the spear, interestingly, that he carries, the end of it, the spear tip of it, is made of iron, which was the metal that was just beginning to come onto the scene in military history at this point, as new metalworking technologies were becoming more popular. So he's carrying an iron spear, which makes him even more imposing as a figure, because an iron spear would pierce bronze shields and bronze coats of mail. And in front of him walks a shield bearer. Hard to know exactly what this implies. It's not unusual for ancient warriors to have shield bearers, but it might also be an attempt by the narrator to emphasize again the size of Goliath's weapons, because his shield was so big that it needed to be carried by a second person. Another way to think about this is Goliath had so many weapons on him, he didn't have any free hands to march with his shield, and so he needed somebody else to carry it. It's still another way to read this. The story says that this shield bearer was walking in front of Goliath. Well, one of the points that Malcolm Gladwell makes when he recounts the story is that Goliath's hulking size was the product of basically an overactive growth hormone in his system, which then affected his vision. So he had bad vision, kind of double vision. And so the shield bearer would be walking in front of him because the shield bearer basically functions as his eyes. And then if you actually read the story through that lens, it is kind of interesting because Goliath says things to David that seem to imply that he can't really see him. He says, "Why do you come after me with sticks?" When the story says that David only had a staff, one stick. Maybe Goliath saw more than one with double vision. Who knows for sure? But it is an interesting take. In any case, the narrator of this story is going out of his or her way to portray Goliath in the mammoth proportions, and it serves a literary function in the story, because by portraying Goliath in such grandiose terms, so such huge proportions, it sets up this stark contrast with David, who is the youngest of the brothers. He's a shepherd. He's from the fields. He doesn't have any weaponry. He doesn't have a coat of mail or a shield or any of that stuff. All he has is a staff and a sling. So there's a sharp contrast between Goliath and David. And the way the narrator sets up this contrast is to emphasize the size of Goliath and the size of the weapons and the armor that he carries. We're also told in the story that Goliath didn't just come out once to taunt and talk trash to the Israelite army. We didn't actually read the section where this is mentioned. It's in verse 16. But in verse 16, it says that Goliath did this 40 days in a row, marching out in between the two armies and talking trash to the Israelites. Now, in verses 12 and following, we're given a little backstory about how David even ended up on the front lines. And we're told that his older brothers were in the army, they were on the front lines, and that his father Jesse wanted him to bring some supplies and provisions to his brothers, special food that they may not have had because of army rations being fairly restrictive. So David is bringing special food for them. And it helps to explain how David ends up there and how he ends up being in earshot of Goliath's taunts. Now, we're going to skip ahead to verse 22. There is an interesting literary technique that the narrator uses. So we're told in verse 22 that David leaves the stuff and the provisions that he had brought for his brothers. He leaves them with someone in order to get a better look at the giant and to better hear what the giant is saying. So he moves from where he leaves the supplies closer to the front. Now, that little mentioning of him leaving the supplies is something that's repeated 3 times in the story. 3 times David leaves something behind. So when he goes to bring the provisions to his brothers, the narrator says he leaves his sheep with someone else to tend them. Then here he leaves the provisions that he brought for his brothers with someone else so that he can go and get a better look at the giant. And then when it comes time to actually face off against the giant, David leaves the armor of King Saul behind. He tried it on, he couldn't move with it, so he took it off and left it in order to go face the giant on his own terms. So each one of these together they serve a literary function. It's basically a kind of character development in the story of David. So he's basically moving from being a shepherd and then maturing beyond just being a delivery boy for his brothers, and then moving even beyond King Saul to become his own man. And ultimately, he will become king himself. So just in this compressed story, we see character development in the character of David as he moves from being just a mere shepherd to being his own man and a hero in his own right, which qualifies him to then become king in Israel. So verse 22 gives us a little window into that literary strategy used by the narrator. Now verses 31 to 37. I want to reread this because the speech that David makes justifying why he should go and fight is useful to focus on. So when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. So Saul asked David to come near, and here's what David says to him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." Then David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So this is a hinge moment in the story. So David steps forward and volunteers, and King Saul tries to talk him out of it. And David appeals to his success against wild beasts as evidence that he can be successful against this giant Goliath. Now, his speech to Saul is very carefully worded. David talks about chasing down bears and lions who are threatening his sheep. And then when he tracks them down, he'll even rescue the sheep from the lion's mouth. And then he will grab the lion or the bear by the jaw and slay it if he needs to. It is a carefully worded speech because David in the speech never says how he kills these wild beasts. He just says that he does. And the way that he phrases it to Saul, it makes it seem like David killed these things with his bare hands. So it's a bit of self-aggrandizement here. He's portraying himself in kind of heroic terms and courageous terms against these wild beasts, even though, and we only learn this later on in the story when we actually get to the battle sequence, most likely the way that David killed lions and bears was with his devastating sling from great distance. He didn't actually go up and grab literally the lion or the bear by the jaw. But it's a carefully worded speech to hammer home the point that David is more than capable of taking on this giant. Now, another feature of this speech that's interesting is that it isn't just about self-aggrandizement. It's not just about David talking in grandiose terms about what he's done to kill wild beasts in the past. It also is a statement about faith or trust. So David's own faith or trust in God. He attributes his success against wild beasts to God. And the rest of the story continues this blending of David's skill and courage and his complete trust that God is the one who has helped him be successful and helped to deliver him from the wild beasts. It's almost as if he's saying, when I go out against this giant, I will use all of my skills and talents to face him down, to challenge him. But at the same time, I realize that it's going to be God who will be at work in this struggle. So it's both and. It's not just my skill and my courage. It's also the fact that in the midst of my struggle against either wild beasts or Goliath, God is going to be present and make my struggle ultimately successful. So an entire sermon, I think, could just be preached on that both and. Both our effort, our work, our hands and feet in the world being the actual hands and feet of God, both and. That the way that God actually brings about things in the world is through us. Likewise with David here, the way that he ends up being successful is not just his own skill, but it's God working through him when it comes to exercising his skill. So I think an entire sermon could just be preached on that, the kind of hand-glove relationship between people and God. But that's not the point that I want to focus on. I'm going to get to my point in just a bit. Now, one more thing about David's speech. He follows a Hebrew literary technique here where a person speaks, then stops, waiting for some kind of response. And when no response is given from the people the person is speaking to, the person will then continue their speech. And we can actually see this in this speech and also in the speech of Goliath. So this is verse 36. This is David speaking. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. Pause. Then verse 37, David said, the Lord who has saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, etc., etc. So you see the technique there. So David speaks. There's an implicit pause between verses 36 and 37, waiting for a response. No response is given. And then the editorial insertion, David said, and he continues his speech. Same technique is used in the speech of Saul, verses 8 through 10. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Pause. Then verse 10. And the Philistine said, so you see the editorial insertion, and the Philistine said, and then he goes on. Today I defy the ranks of Israel, etc., etc. So it's actually a fairly common literary technique. And the implication is that the speaker has rendered silent the audience. Hence the implicit pause and then the editorial insertion to continue the speaker's speech. So for David's speech, basically who's going to challenge David after he spoke about killing wild beasts and after he said that God would be with him? The both and again. He's, exercising a little self-aggrandizement here, talking about his successes in the past, but then he attributes that success to God. So it's trust. So you have both and, both his skill and courage and his trust in God. Who is going to challenge him? Hence the implicit pause. And then he continues with his speech. And then the response finally comes from King Saul. King Saul basically says, okay, go for it. Okay, then we get to the battle sequence. This is verses 41 through 50. I'm not going to reread it, except to say that it's a quick-paced narrative. It's 9 verses, moves very rapidly, and you have some trash talking going back and forth between David and Goliath. And then David, with the skill that he has in slinging his stones, is able to topple the giant. Now, what is it about a sling that makes it so devastating against such a mammoth opponent? Well, this brings me back to Malcolm Gladwell, where he describes the devastating effects of a sling. So I'm going to read a section to you. Slinging took an extraordinary amount of skill and practice, but in experienced hands, the sling was a devastating weapon. Paintings from medieval times show slingers hitting birds in mid-flight. Irish slingers were said to be able to hit a coin from as far away as they could see it. And in the Old Testament book of Judges, slingers are described as being accurate within a, quote, hair's breadth. An experienced slinger could kill or seriously injure a target at a distance of up to 200 yards. The Roman army even had a special set of tongs made just to remove stones that had been embedded in some poor soldier's body by a sling. Imagine standing in front of a Major League Baseball pitcher as he aims a baseball at your head. That's what facing a slinger was like. Only what was being thrown was not a ball of cork and leather, but a solid rock. Goliath is heavy infantry. He thinks that he is going to be engaged in a duel with another heavy infantryman. When he says, "Come to me, that I may give your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field," the key phrase is "come to me." He means come right up to me so that we can fight at close quarters. When Saul tries to dress David in armor and give him his sword, he is operating under the same assumption. He assumes David is going to fight Goliath hand to hand. David, however, has no intention of honoring the rituals of single combat. When he tells Saul that he has killed bears and lions as a shepherd, he does so not just as a testimony to his courage, but to make another point as well, that he intends to fight Goliath the same way he has learned to fight wild animals, as a projectile warrior. Okay. Malcolm Gladwell goes on to say that Goliath had about as much a chance of being successful in this one-on-one battle as he would have been if someone was shooting a handgun at him. That's how effective a sling was in the ancient world. So when we step back from the story and think about it at the literary level, one of the interesting features of it is that it almost functions in a way as a kind of folklore fairy tale type story. And this indeed is the point that scholar Robert Alter makes. He says it follows a folklore pattern. And this is common when you read fairy tale literature. So a group of people, whether it's in a kingdom or a castle or a town, they're being harassed and oppressed by an ogre or a dragon or some kind of giant. The king and the people are dismayed. And then a surprise, unlikely hero emerges from the countryside, battles the foe, emerges victorious, and then is exalted in the end. And so this story of David and Goliath follows that same kind of template. But in terms of applying this kind of a story, it's not enough just to say, well, it's an entertaining fairy tale type story. It actually does have a lesson, as do all fairy tale stories. So one way we might apply it is to ask the question about giants, to focus on the Goliath type giants, and then ask the question, what might giants look like in our own lives? And the thing that comes to mind for me when I ask that question is, what are the kinds of things that we're afraid of? Now, in the story, Saul and the entire Israelite army are quaking with fear when Goliath talks trash to them. So the element of fear is present in the story, fear at the presence of giants. So what might giants be? What are the things that make us afraid? A domineering parent we can't please. A person in a pickup truck with an AR-15 sticker on the back window of the pickup truck might make us nervous or even afraid. For some people, they're afraid of the vaccine. Most people are afraid to a certain degree of COVID-19. More personally, we could be afraid that we're not talented enough or smart enough to be successful or to compete successfully or even to be on the same level with our peers. We might be afraid that we're not going to be accepted for who we are. Money problems cause people all kinds of fear. There's fear of illness or death for ourselves or for people we love. Fear of climate change and what the future might hold. And then, of course, there's a general fear of otherness. And in particular, thinking in our country's context, the otherness that almost half the country is other from wherever we might be positioned. Other in the sense of just being different and coming at things from a different political vantage point. One that we might even think is damaging and detrimental. So then we come back to Malcolm Gladwell talking about giants. And what he says is giants are not what we think they are. The same qualities that appear to give them strength are often the sources of great weakness. The powerful and strong are not always what they seem. Now, this is not to say that just because giants are not what they seem, then we should deliberately put ourselves in harm's way or in places where we're not going to be safe or unsafe situations in order to face down giants. That's not the lesson. The lesson rather invites us, I think, to ask whether the idea of the giant in our minds is bigger than the actual giant itself. And one more final point, and I'll close with this. It brings us back to the element of faith. I find David's faith in this story to be extraordinary. So he trusts completely that God will be present in his struggle with this giant. And maybe that's the faith lesson for all of us. So no matter how big we think the giant is, it can always be released into God's loving arms. So we might make this a part of our daily prayer or meditation. That is that you sit with the giant in your mind as you breathe, and you exhale the giant into God. And then you inhale God's calming spirit, and you trust that God will be at work to bring that giant to its knees. See you next week.